Hey there fellow creators, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and this week we are going to essentially do the impossible by erasing acrylic paint off of a canvas. Stick around. So recently I was switching between paintings, the two that I have in progress and unfortunately I've had in progress for quite a while, when I realized that when I grabbed some of my high flow dioxazine purple off of the shelf and put it back, it dripped right here. Now this particular little drip is probably one of the more convenient places that this drip could have been, but because it crosses both between land and sky, I do have to fix it a little bit more than otherwise just painting over it would accomplish. So if I just paint over yellow on top of this dark purple, it's going to show through pretty much no matter how many layers it takes to go through it. Plus the texture of the drip itself is there, so I have to do a little bit more work than just paint over it, especially considering how far along this painting is. So in order to erase acrylic paint, and a lot of people are like, well, once it's on there, it won't come off ever. It's acrylic. That's what it does. But there is a trick to this, and the trick actually harkens back to a video that I made about cleaning dried acrylic paint out of your brush. A lot of people say, oh, well, the paint's dried in the brush and it's dead and I just have to throw it away. No, you can bring it back to life in the same way that you can erase acrylic paint, and that is with some rubbing alcohol, isopropyl 70%. So with this, a nice stiff brush, this is a very stiff, short out of the ferrule, I've had it for a really long time, kind of a scrubby brush, love using it for stuff like this, as well as the Q-tips, which I almost lost on my own table here. Clearly I have to clean up around here. Let's get started. So as you guys can see a little bit closer now, nice, solid, very dark drip here right across the upper part of this mountain, some of the background mountain as well as some of the sky. Now, thankfully this isn't like way over here in the other sky area, but then again, there's a lot of complex color and glazing I already have going on over here. So for me to just paint over this would be a lot more challenging than you might think. So for me, in this instance, it's actually easier to try and lift this paint off than to try and paint over it, at least for the most part. Now, ideally, I would have pulled this paint up the day that I noticed the drip. Unfortunately, my motivation in the studio lately has been not great, so this has actually been sitting for almost 2 weeks now. So this is going to be a little bit more challenging, and for sure I will need to do some paint overs and touch-ups anyway. But I thought this would be a really great way to demo this little technique, especially to help you guys save some of your paintings going forward. So I'm going to take a little jar here and just squeeze out some rubbing alcohol, taking a couple of Q-tips, and I might end up needing to do some scraping as well. I've got a palette knife here that I actually sharpen the edge of, specifically to help me with little projects and things like this. Worst case scenario, I can also come at this with an X-Acto knife, but that is very dangerous to not want to poke a hole straight through the canvas, as long as I'm careful. But for this, I'm just going to go ahead and saturate the Q-tip, and then very gently, because you want to be careful not to rip up the surrounding paint, so this is going to be probably where the brush is going to come in a little bit more handy. I just want to saturate that section in the middle. Give that a minute. Not too long though, rubbing alcohol dries like quickly. And very kind of gently twisting and rubbing. And like magic, that starts to come off. Now the edges are where I'm probably going to still have to do a little retouching on the surface, but there's always the chance you're going to pull some of your underlying paint up anyway. But that is already going to be a lot easier to retouch now that the bulk of that is off. Go ahead and take this brush now and scrub that a little. And the underlying paint had been on there a lot longer, despite being the drip on there for like 2 weeks or whatever. The underlying paint was on there a lot longer, so that bond is also going to be a lot more reasonably formed. All right, that's looking a lot better. this is still pretty thick. I don't know how much it's really hard to see, especially for the mountain side of this, how much is actually the purple and how much is actually the mountain. I was planning on doing another layer on top of that though anyway, which is nice. What's interesting about this technique is if you get paint on a pair of your clothes that you don't want paint on, as long as the paint's relatively fresh in that instance, you can kind of do this with that to get paint out of your clothes too. Although, thankfully, if you're doing it on with your clothes, it shouldn't take as much, or you should be able to put a little more effort in scrubbing it off. Sorry about the sniffling. Suddenly, my nose decided to start running like crazy. Just in time to record, of course. Seems like most of that's starting to lift off now. I actually am starting to notice myself lifting a bit more of the mountain, so I gotta probably just take the rest of that to the knife work. Okay, I think that's probably as good as I'm going to get with the rubbing alcohol. I'm actually going to go ahead and set the palette knife aside. I don't think I'm going to need that, but I am going to delicately perform a little surgery on this as well. And with the knife it would be really easy to scrape through every layer of paint. So it's really tricky to try and just pull up that upper layer, and I still might not be able to. Especially on this strip, seems like it's gonna be a little harder to do that with. But as long as, again, with the rubbing alcohol, because we've softened that underlying paint a bit, yeah, I definitely don't think I'm gonna get very far with this. It's not doing enough based on what I need, so I will set that aside and not worry about it. Last thing I probably want to do here is just scrub a little bit with this brush. Again, need to be really careful I'm not pulling that underlying paint up, and it looks like I am starting to again with some of those areas. It's very easy to do that, especially with a sky that doesn't have quite as many layers of paint, say, as the land would. But that little bit of extra texture from the brush does certainly help. And right about like that, yeah, I definitely see myself starting to rip some brown up. So that's roughly where that's going to have to sit. Yeah, I definitely just pulled some yellow up there too. Okay, so at this point, now I definitely can't pull any more paint up, but that does mostly hide the problem, and I should have no problem now remixing these paint colors and fixing that the rest of the way. But real simple, a couple of Q-tips and some rubbing alcohol, that is how you erase acrylic paint. So now, at a distance, you can no longer see that drip. Again, I still have to touch it up and rework the color a little bit so it's not visible up close, but from here you can't even tell it was ever there, which is cool. Now, I want to make note that this little technique of erasing paint isn't just for mistakes. You can use it in a more creative way to selectively subtract some paint from other paint. For a little bit more on this technique, be sure to check out a video I did a couple of years ago. I think it's just called developing a new art technique, where I take a panel that I used some RNF pigment sticks on, oil sticks, let that dry completely, clear coat it. On top of that, I painted with acrylic, and then on top, once that acrylic dried, usually black acrylic, then I came in with the rubbing alcohol to do a selective subtraction to it, so all of the underlying color then shows through the black, kind of like a scratch board, but doing so with just layers of paint and then some subtractive methods. It's a really wild technique, and I probably should get back to doing it a little bit more, but it takes the idea of erasing acrylic paint and applies it to a project for a more creative idea rather than a fixing the mistake idea. But if you happen to make a little drip on your painting, you're like, oh no, it's ruined, try this out for yourself, and maybe you can save a piece without having to completely repaint a layer. So that's it for today's little almost a quick tip kind of video. If you ever make a mistake on your painting, don't fret. There's ways to lift that paint right off. For oil, yeah, dump some mineral spirits on that thing and just scrape it clean. But for acrylics, you can erase the paint. Grab yourself some rubbing alcohol and a little bit of a finesse, and you can pull that layer right off. As always, if you enjoyed this or learned something, go ahead and hit that like button and let me know your thoughts and comments below. Check me out on socials in the description box below, including the community Discord, where you can learn more tips like this and ask me questions directly. Keep on creating, get subscribed if you're not already, and this has been Cinder Studios, and I will see you guys next time. That was really roundabout. I almost had that, and then it just went off the rails.